Hi, everybody. This is just a little video that I've made to help you get through and understand the reading, Protecting the Routine from Chaos by Daniel Chambliss. I'm coming to you from another planet. Got Yoda and his wisdom here to help you understand as well. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I've just got a short PowerPoint, lots of images, just to give you kind of an overview and some insights into the reading. So bear with me as I share my screen with you. And all right. Here we go. Okay, so Protecting the Routine from Chaos. This is by a sociologist named Daniel Chambliss, and as you've gathered, if you've read it, which you need to do, so this is a study about hospitals, right? And about the kinds of things that happen in hospitals that would be considered pretty bizarre if they happened outside of a hospital setting. And so this is focusing on nurses, but really these strategies are applicable to doctors and all of the other kinds of hospital workers that we might talk about. So it's a study about hospitals, but an important thing to remember is that this is also a study that is about a lot more than hospitals. So much like our article about emotion work in animal shelters was about these specific strategies that people in animal shelters used to do emotion work, but it was really about emotional strategies in general. This study about hospitals and hospital workers is actually about much more general ideas for understanding how the social world works. So we're going to go through what some of those are. So the big split here, right, is these two concepts, the routine and chaos, hence the title of the article, Protecting the Routine from Chaos. So the analogy that I like to use is routine. It's kind of like when you're driving on a long road with not much around it, right? It's pretty boring, it's pretty regular, it's pretty routine. Often think of the New York State Thruway like this. If you've spent a lot of time driving on that, you just kind of go along, right? We don't pay too much attention to it. We might very much be, we might be listening to a podcast, we might be talking to somebody, we might be rocking out to some music, but everything seems normal, everything seems as it should be, and we take it for granted. So routine refers to the normal, taken for granted sense of the world that we have. This should hopefully sound familiar from the beginning of the semester when we talked about the construction of reality, right? That this is what reality often feels like too. In this article, Chambliss is referring to that normal, taken for granted sense of the world as routine, and he also refers to it as the, quote, social order, okay? Contrasting that is chaos. So I think of that as what happens when basically our road, our sense of what is normal, has tons of upheaval, right? So this is after an earthquake. I think about movies, disaster movies where they show, the highway is sort of buckling as somebody's driving on it. It is the sense of, oh my God, what is going on here, right? That there's a challenge to what is considered normal and routine and the basics of reality. So chaos refers to when things threaten to or do in fact disrupt our sense of what is normal. It turns out that these two concepts, right, the routine and chaos, have a lot to do with our guy, Erving Goffman. So remember, he's my sociology boyfriend. And so you've read him, right? He's the guy who wrote The Presentation of Self and Face Work and Interaction Rituals. And we've been talking about lots of his ideas in class. He's the one that the folks who wrote about emotions kept referencing, saying, hey, Goffman did some good work here on interactions, but he didn't account for these different aspects of emotions. So this article, too, is incorporating Goffman in some of his ideas in some direct and some indirect ways. So Goffman's idea of the definition of the situation that we've talked about, right? Remember, that's the answer to the question, what's going on here, relates to Chambliss, this article's author, relates to Chambliss's ideas of the routine and chaos. So routine is when the definition of the situation is accepted, right? What Goffman then calls the working consensus. And so in this article, right, that's really in a hospital, the day-to-day life of the hospital workers. Whereas by contrast, chaos is when the definition of the situation is called into question, right? So all of the things that would be considered totally freaky, weird, upsetting, etc., outside a medical setting, right? Those are things that are potential chaos that would lead us to go, what's happening here? This is not normal. This is not routine. And you can kind of see this in, if you've ever had a visible injury of some kind. So if you've had a broken arm, or maybe you've had a black eye, right? But some kind of visible injury, outside of a medical setting, that tends to dominate interactions. You think about if you've ever, again, had a visible injury, if you got sick of people asking you what happened, right? If you have a cast on, basically every interaction you have with somebody, then you're, oh my God, what happened to you, right? And yet in a medical setting, those things are considered part of the routine. If you have a cast on, everybody you see does not ask, oh my gosh, what happened to you? It's considered normal to have things physically wrong with you inside a medical setting. Whereas in interactions outside a medical setting, we think that that is notable, right? It calls the definition of the situation into question. So the idea of routine in this article is really related to this popular meme that you may have seen before. But in this instance, there's not sarcasm in it as the meme is usually interpreted. This article is about how nurses in hospitals, and really other hospital workers as well, are this little dog who genuinely are thinking this is fine as all of these chaotic things are going on around them. How do they redefine this situation that from the outside is going to look like it's a real mess and chaos? And they're able to inhabit this and genuinely embrace this idea that this is fine, right? So these flames might be, representing people dying, people almost dying, people missing body parts, people bleeding profusely. All of that gets incorporated into the routine. So this meme, in a non-sarcastic sense, right, actually really represents what this article is talking about in terms of hospital workers. So there's two kinds of threats to the routine, right? So the article talks about that there's external threats and there's internal threats. So external threats are those that are caused by non-medical personnel, by folks who don't work in the medical setting. So this might be worried family members who, right, in some way or another are freaking out or really concerned about their loved ones. And this can also be when there's some kind of a sudden crisis with a patient, right? So a patient who is stable is suddenly not anymore, or starts bleeding profusely, or has a heart attack. So those are external threats to the routine. And then there's internal threats. So these come from the hospital workers themselves, right? These are things that call the definition of the situation, right? The idea of what is normal into question. And most often these involve unsuccessful emotion management. So remember that term, emotion management or emotion work, which we talked about last week, efforts to change either your surface or internal emotional state. When hospital workers are unsuccessful at that, it often then causes a threat to the routine, right? It's a way of letting chaos in. So the article talks about different strategies, right, that nurses and other hospital workers use to maintain order or routine, also known as, right, keeping the definition of the situation intact or preserving the sense of what is normal. So one of them is to keep outsiders out, right? So basically, we're physically removing an audience to these things that might not be considered normal, that might be upsetting and disturbing if the audience members were there. So audience members just refers to people who don't work in the hospital. So the article talked about how visiting hours are one way to do that. Sure, they're probably good for patients, but they're probably also just as much for keeping the visibility of these potentially chaotic things away from audience members who might then react in such a way that it challenges the routineness or the taken for grantedness or the definition of the situation. It's sort of like removing the little kid from the fable about the emperor having no clothes. It's removing all of the possible people who might say, hey, the emperor has no clothes, or hey, this is really freaky and scary. So physically removing people who might point out that, hey, this is not normal, this is not routine, is one strategy. Another one is that the hospital workers themselves basically don't let on that things aren't okay when there are other audience members around. So the article talked about how someone was being resuscitated, 10 or 15 feet away from a new patient who was being wheeled in, and how everybody just pretended that this was totally fine and nothing was weird about that, right? So cognitively too, right, hospital workers don't let on that things aren't okay. The second strategy is routinization routines. So this is basically having a set way of doing things over and over again. That helps contribute to normality. So in hospitals, rounds are a main way that happens. That's when doctors, often medical students too, groups, sometimes the nurses go around and visit patients and talk about what's going on with them. It's, again, a way of normalizing, here is, Mrs. Menendez and she's missing a hand and here's what we're going to do. If that's just part of what happens every day, that makes that seem like it's something normal in a way that outside a medical setting, somebody missing a hand would certainly not be. The second thing, and this is not actually in the reading explicitly, but is an important part of routinization, is that there are set procedures and pre-planned steps for dealing with things that are unusual. They don't reinvent the wheel. So if someone is crashing, right, if a patient, right, if their heart stops or they stop breathing, they don't have to, hospital workers don't have to figure out what to do, right? There's a set series of procedures that you follow, right? How you call for help, where you get a crash part, who does what, and that also helps contribute to the sense of routine and normality. The third strategy, which we've talked about before, right, last week and the week before, is to use humor. So humor creates emotional and psychological distance from things. So that's a way, again, of keeping the sense of what is normal. When things are humorous, we treat them as inherently not counting. So if you can make a joke about something, it's a way of saying, well, that doesn't really count in this interaction. And if you make a joke about something that's potentially upsetting, disturbing, AKA not normal, it's a way of sort of saying, hey, I don't have to worry about this causing chaos in my routine. So one of the things I'd like you to think about is where else we've talked about humor and its role in interaction and how that relates to how humor is used by the hospital workers talked about in this article. And then the fourth strategy, right, is to just keep going. So they talk about how even when it is absolutely obvious that things are not normal, that there is chaos, that hospital workers just keep going and keep pretending like everything is fine. So in the fable of, where the emperor has no clothes, it's all the other people who just keep going, of course the emperor's got clothes on. Must, right? Who behave that way even when it is obvious and apparent that they don't. So even when strange things happen, that it's unavoidable, right? That the other strategies aren't working, that hospital workers just keep going. Right? They carry on as if everything is fine. And that carrying on like this is part of the role expectations of being a hospital worker, right? It's not just a personality trait. It's part of the role, right? Roles have expected behaviors and attitudes. And for hospital workers, one of them is to just carry on as if everything is normal, even when it is really apparent that they are not. So this is an article that is focused on how order and routine are maintained in hospitals. But as I said at the beginning, this is actually an article that is about a much bigger idea than that. How we keep what Chambliss calls the social order in general, our idea of what is normal. So a good exercise for us to see how these strategies are actually used in other settings is to think about how we've used these strategies to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. So the COVID pandemic, especially in March and April and May when it was first happening, was essentially a giant earthquake on our nice road of routine and normality that we had. So the question that I want us to think about is how do we maintain the social order, right? Protect the routine from chaos during a global pandemic. It was super freaky, especially when this first started unfolding, right? We had the sense that things are not normal. But I think that there are clear ways that we actually used these same four strategies that the hospital workers did. So the first, to keep outsiders out. In this case, I think outsiders was actually outside information. So if you paid attention or looked for any advice about how to cope with the pandemic and being in quarantine. Two of the most common things, right, were to basically, take a break and relax. So do fun things that you normally enjoy doing, and to limit your information, right? To not look at the news too much, to not follow every detail. That is essentially the same as keeping outsiders out, right? This is the idea of, intentionally ignore what's happening in the world to focus on yourself. That's the same strategy, to keep outsiders out. We were also all really encouraged, right, to maintain our daily routines, right? So when we were in quarantine, one of the biggest pieces of advice was to, don't just spend the whole day in your pajamas. That yes, people should really, get up and get changed and take a shower, and that was really important. The third is humor. So, I just picked one, but the number of memes that are out there about COVID-19 and about 2020 in general is kind of mind-blowing. This is one of our standard responses to our sense of normality being challenged, is that we use humor as a way of saying, hey, this maybe doesn't count, right? This is a way of coping, a way of keeping chaos at bay. And the last thing is that we just keep going, right? Even when it's weird and bizarre, we tend to just keep going. So this is a photograph of me from March, right after spring break. And this is me wearing a mask to Wegmans to go grocery shopping for the first time. And this was before everybody was wearing masks. So I was one of only a handful of people in the store that had a mask on. And I took a picture of this because I felt I was so freaked out by the fact that I was going to have to wear a mask to go grocery shopping. And I thought, boy, I'm going to want a picture of this, right? I went grocery shopping anyway. And now I've done that many, many times since then. And part of just keeping going is that things that initially feel really bizarre, like they are chaos, challenging our routine, come to feel normal. So now I wear my mask when I go to the grocery store or anytime I'm in public around other people, and it feels normal. I don't notice it anymore. So that's just an example, right? That we just keep going. We adapted. We had Zoom meetings, right, with people. We set up Zoom happy hours. We figured out ways to be socially distant but still interact with each other. Those are all ways of bringing what is chaotic and bringing it back under the umbrella of what is normal. So the take-home message here from this is that this is not just an article about hospitals, right? It's about the idea that what is normal and what is reality is created through our day-to-day interactions with each other, right? That we, through face-to-face interactions or Zoom-to-Zoom interactions, right, that we create what is normal, even though we very often take that for granted. So it's not just a study about hospital workers, it's a study about how in